In this video, I want to continue talking about the full stack story of Fulcro and some of the nuances that you'll need to understand to do a good job there. I'd like to start off this video just by noting a few things about the IDE stuff that I'm using here. You may be noticing in your IDE when you're playing with the source code that defsc might be turning up yellow, as if it's not, or actually defsc won't be yellow, person picker would be yellow if you're experiencing this problem. And that if you're on the symbol and you say navigate, jump to the declaration, it doesn't do that. And that's a good one to know, jump to declaration. On mine, I've got it set to command B. And then I've got back, which is navigate back, set to command left bracket, like in browser, back. So I can jump to something and then go back. Now, if this is showing up yellow, that won't be working for you. And the way to fix it in IntelliJ is to click on this light bulb, and it'll say, well, no, we don't want to resolve. You want to click on the macro name. So defsc, click on the light bulb, resolve defsc as, and then specify, and then type in defsc, and use the old one from Fulcro 2. Cursive has built-in support for some Fulcro definitions and macros, and the syntax of them is identical. So if you tell IntelliJ that defsc in ComFulcroLogic Fulcro components, the new one, works like the old one, then it'll recognize the syntax of that and index those. The same thing goes for mutations. Mutations internally are actually multi-methods. That's technically what def mutation outputs. So for example, this make older mutation here, you can actually write as a def method m/mutate on the symbol make older, right? Because this is a data kind of thing. I thought that was the multi-method name. Mutate, excuse me, mutate. And this takes, I don't remember what I made this take in Fulcro 3. I think it just takes an environment. And then this returns a map with the sections in it. I think each of these gets an end, and maybe this gets the end as well. I don't remember exactly what it looks like because I always use def mutation. But if you go and look at the macro, it outputs a def method, env, and then it outputs a method map, which is just a map that has the various handlers in it as keys. So there'd be an action, and there'd be a remote. Right? That's the equivalent. The problem is I can't, if I do it that way, not only does make older show up as a unknown symbol because it's just a piece of data, there's no way to make the IDE understand that multi-method symbol resolution is this mutation. Whereas if I give you a macro, not only can I syntax check it a little bit, I can also let you then, or really the IDE can then let you say, oh, this thing, resolve that as if it, and again, if you go looking for the old def mutation, Cursive already knows how to resolve those. I'll be talking with the developers of Cursive soon to see if they'll alias over these for us. But if you do that and it hadn't been done, these should index, these should no longer be yellow, and your jump to the definition should work. So these didn't have to be macros. Really, neither did defsc. Defsc is just a convenience. You can actually define a function. I mean, this is sort of how you do it in React, right? Or in JavaScript, it's how you make a class. You make some function, and then there's a configure component function call that you can pass a function to, and it'll turn it into a React class. That's essentially, along with the options map. So that's essentially what the macro does. But again, it's much easier to have something that goes through and defines the symbol, does some syntax error checking for you, and then does, declares it, does a little bit of let magic. Like it's just making it a little easier to deal with. But to me, the big deal is once you've got these things developed as macros that behave sort of like defin or def mutation or whatever, you can tell the ID they define something and get symbol resolution, get ID navigation, which as your project gets larger becomes very, very important. When you're working with something like, say Redux, where you go and you define all of your things as strings, Okay, I want to jump to this thing that executes this action string. Well, you just have to know where that is, or you have to drop to a command line and grep for it. You can't just say jump me to that thing. It's just not something the development environment is going to be able to do for you very easily or accurately. It would just be at best a heuristic of, all right, find all the strings that say that, and we'll jump you to the one that we think is that thing. So Clojure really is a superpower here. Macros for library use and these sorts of situations really buy you a lot in scalability. Okay, so that's enough of ID commentary. So let's talk about this refactoring that I've done here. You see I've set this up so I'm going to show a list of people on the left, and then you're going to be able to select one, and then it's going to show you the selected person on the right. And this is enough to let me show you a number of common things you run into when dealing with interactions with the server. So we're not quite to forms, but this is sort of on the way to that sort of interaction. So what I've done is I still have my root component. Remember, that's kind of special, so we typically just link that down to the thing that we really are interested in. So I've still got my header here, and then person picker. And people are sometimes tempted, so this is a quick note about a big mistake you can make, and that is if you run this get query in a REPL, let me do a CLJS REPL, you'll see that it returns a vector. Well, a vector is a legal query, so people think, oh, well, I'll just do that. That's all I really want, and then I'll just pass the props straight through. And actually, this will error check and complain if you do that, but you could get away with doing it that way. Oh wait, query needs. Oh no, it's complaining that initial state has to be a function if you make query a function, because it can't analyze this. It's sort of like telling you, well, if you make the query where I can't check it out, I can't do any magic for you in the initial state. So this compiles. It doesn't give you an error. This is a vector, which is what a query should be. Technically, this looks like it will work, and technically, it sort of will. Well, as you can see, things are rendering. The problem is what I talked about the other day in maybe 2 or 3 videos ago with the refresh story. Remember, there's metadata on this query that tells you that tells the system which component that query came from. And what we've done here is we've made that metadata mismatch the component it's coming from. And so that's a problem. So we don't want that. And in fact, if we were composing these together, that would be a mismatch that then if you composed it into another thing above it, the one above it would call get query on whatever this returned and replace that metadata, and now things are just all wonky. So don't return another component's query as your own. That's a big no-no. So you always want to make up an edge in a join to go down a level, right? This is a node. To travel out of a node via query or props or rendering, you need a data edge. That rule is sort of flexible. You could have a component in the middle that's completely stateless, that has no query ident or anything, and is just acting as a React component transmitting data through it, but not asking for any of its own. So there's a little bit of technicality in there, but for the most part, if you want to move from one layer to the next, there has to be a join, and the join has to use an invented key. And part of making that tractable is initial state, healing or setting up these edges for you as the application starts. As the application runs, of course, you're responsible for making these edges exist in your reified data here in the database. And that's one of the central tasks of doing any programming in Fulcro. Really, in Fulcro, you're not UI programming as much as you are data model programming, which is a much better thing to do, in my opinion, and a much easier thing to test technically. Like, you can very easily test a pure data model. This is just an immutable data structure, and your mutations are just functions that take it from one state to the next. And the UI just happens to show it, right? It's a visualization of this graph. It's another way to look at it. Okay, so don't steal queries. All right, next, I mean, along those same lines, don't mismatch queries. Like if you've got a query that you used, uh, um, like up here, I've got two things that are representing people. I've got person list item. Well, let's go through the refactoring. Let's just get to it. Okay, so root goes to a person picker, which is this thing that has two columns. So you see person picker has two column grid. One of the columns is the person list, and one of the columns is person detail. We see two edges going out of the UI tree. We see two edges in joins in the query. We see one edge in the initial state because selected person, well, nobody's selected yet, so I don't have anything to initialize there. So I'm actually going to leave that edge unpopulated. It's just going to not exist. So as a result, this is going to come in nil. So there's some argument, some valid argument to say, well, since that could be nil, maybe I should say when there's a selected person, I'll render something in that column, right? So then the column doesn't even appear there. And that avoids potential warnings and things in the console over here, which I was probably getting, which I was, right? It was telling me I was getting something where the ident was nil for a thing. So that's probably why I was getting that warning. Okay. So I've got those, and then I made two different person components. So this is the next interesting detail, I think, for people who are new to Fulcro, is there's a person list. These aren't what I was trying to compare and contrast. Let's talk about the person list first. The person list is just what you saw before. It's just a component that represents the people that are going to be shown. It does a little extra formatting, and then it maps over the people. This is another place where it's tempting to steal the query, right? The only data that you need here came from this thing. Why not just promote that up and ignore the edge? Don't do that. You'll break things. You always need the edge, and chances are at some point in the future you're going to add some additional stuff to this list, sort order, whatever, that's specific to this list. So make it an edge. And then that goes down to the UI person list item. So this is the thing that I changed. So UI person list item, well, this is just, a list of people. I don't need to know their name. I don't need to know their ages. I definitely don't need to know their cars. I don't need to know their subgraph of details. All I need to know is their ID so I can normalize them, and the name. That's all I'm going to show. And then I'm going to make an LI with a link that lets me somehow select a person via a transaction. And then I'm going to show, this is actually the label of the button, or the label of the link here. Maybe a little easier to read that way. I'm just going to show the person's name in the list item. At the same time, on the right-hand side of that side-by-side things, if I get rid of this win for the moment, on the right-hand side here, I am going to show all of the details of the person here. So I need a different component for that, but I'm using a normalized database. So person detail is going to have the same ident. It represents a person. But in this case, the person detail wants to know the name, the age, their cars, etc. Okay, now it's important that you remember that queries on these components are overloaded in their purpose. Purpose number one is when we reach this node in the graph, which the parent directed us to by having a join, right? So up here we had people, took us to a person list. Oh, I'm sorry, person detail. We had selected person up here. Going to person detail. This is a real edge in the database, just like picker list is an edge in the database. When the query engine started at root, it walked across this edge, got to this component. This component said, okay, these are the things I'm picking out. It walked these edges, right? These are relative queries. These queries apply as you go. And if you remember in an earlier video, I showed you how the query system can start at an ident and move from there. So I could say, okay, we'll start at person 3 and resolve these things and everything below it. And that's a legal thing to do as well. So we can start at a component, but we're always starting at some entity in the database that has that particular ident or some particular ident to pull the data. So this query serves, the first purpose it serves is pulling data from this client database into this UI. Right? That's purpose number one. Purpose number two we saw in the last video, and that's to pull data from the server. And so here, see now which one? I want the person list component. For the moment, I've dropped the double colons from these just to avoid confusion in viewers. So the person list has a person list people edge. Right? So I'm going to load all people, and I'm going to tell it, take that edge you got from the server that was at the root of a graph and make it this edge of my graph. Right? So then that happens on initial load. So if I load this up, I now see 2 people. So that's all I really wanted from the server. Right? This is the promise of EQL and GraphQL. It's that I can say, oh yeah, to fill out this particular bit of the UI, I just need the ID and the name. If I look in Fulcro here at the network thing that happened, it asked for person ID and name, and the thing it got back were person IDs and names. That's the only network transfer that happened. It's more compact and precise for the particular UI thing that I'm doing at the moment. So when the thing starts, that's exactly what I want to happen. So that's use number 2 of queries, is asking for something from the server. Now, it is perfectly legal to use defsc to define some query and then drop the UI altogether. So I could say I want person ID here, I want person ID here, and maybe I just want person age, and then, you know, I'm not going to render anything, so I just want to say person query, right? So I can reload this over here, and down here I can say, oh, you know, I want to use person query for that. Right? That's a perfectly legal thing to do, and if I reload, you'll see I'll get 2 bullet items with blank names because I didn't ask for the names. And the transaction on the network, you see asked for person age, and it got person ages. But of course, that's not what my UI needs. And in this case, I'm sort of mismatching the two. But it's perfectly legal to structure your queries for normalization purposes into a defsc for just that reason. I just want to load the data. Do not, however, ever, ever, ever put this thing here, right? Because this query is a query trying to satisfy UI concerns. And this query, if it were a person query, is a query that can technically get some data but is not tied to the actual component you're going to render. So that's mistake number 2. Never, ever use a query-only component in a UI position. You can use it in load. That's perfectly fine. You just saw me do it. But if you're using that for some like pre-caching purpose or whatever, make sure that you don't make the mistake of double purposing that, because queries again are overloaded. And in this particular case, the meaning is just, I'm going to use this to pull things from a server and normalize it. I'm never going to render anything with this, as is evidenced by the fact that I didn't give it any render body. Okay. Most of the time you will not write defsc components like that. You'll write it like this. So we've got 2 phases here. Let's go back and change this back to person list item so that we get the correct query on load. And now I've got the people. So let's talk about selecting a person. When I go to select a person, I need to make this edge. And this edge in my database, if we go look at person ID, oh no, select a person, sorry. That's going to be one of these guys. Right, so person picker list, so right here, the person picker. So I want an edge here that says person picker / selected person and has the ident of the person that I'm interested in seeing the details of. So let's go write that. I've already actually written it. So select person is a mutation that swaps against the app state and associates in, and I made these little helper functions so that, you know, when you have to do these often, you can just say, okay, associate in at picker path for the selected person, person ID, and then whatever ID the mutation was passed. Okay, Bob, Sally, Bob, Sally. Great. That's pretty easy. So really, you're seeing right here, again, what you're doing is management of the state model. All I need to do is have this edge here, and the UI will just render what the model says it's supposed to render. Now, the problem, though, you should notice is, well, my load of the list, well, it didn't get age and cars. So age is empty, cars is empty. If I start making older, they're going to start at 1, right? This is wrong. Um, I mean, it's working the way it's been told to work, but obviously there's some data missing here. So we need to heal this, and there are a number of ways we can do this. And I'm going to start with kind of the worst and move towards the best. And of course, worst versus best is always relative. But one of the things we could do, you might be thinking right away, is, well, why not just put a transact in here? Not a transact, a load in here. You can actually get the app from the environment of the action, or you could pull it in via require. And then we could say, okay, well, we're going to load, oh, well, that's just person ID, an ident, and then I need the person class. Well, which person class? I need person detail. Oh, that's a problem. The reason that's a problem, and it's not a terrible problem, but is if I do that, I'm going to get a circular reference. Closure and closure script don't like you going back and forth to each other. So client over here is requiring, for convenience, really, model person, because I want these two things to be in scope. And so I could fix this way. I could comment that out. Okay, now I don't have that going on, but all right. So now I've got to quote this thing and say, all right, that's in app model person. Remember, these are just data, so I can fix that. But you can see, hopefully, immediately why this is less ideal. Is now I don't have any way to alias these, so I'm stuck with just like typing them out as literal symbols. And then if I forget to do something like unquote these maps, then of course I've got a different bug I've got to deal with. But I could save that, and so this is a way that this can work. There's another problem here, but let's just say we do that. So we say, all right, what we're going to do is we're going to make that edge, and then we're going to reload the person from the server, but we're going to load them using person details query, which has name, age, cars, etc. So now if I select, that should work. What do my network transactions look like? Oh, did I do it right? Let me reload and make sure. Model person, select person, load, app, property, person detail. That looks right to me. Oh, we're getting errors. Let's see what the errors say. Unknown app state mutation. Oh, haha. So there's my other problem. Is if I have not required this file anywhere in my application, then the mutations don't get installed. So you can see why this kind of just isn't so great. So I do want to go back to what I had before here, right? So that my mutations end up being installed. Remember, they're multi-methods underneath. So if you don't require a multi-method file, it just doesn't end up in the application and your mutations aren't there. So that's what it was complaining about. So if I go back and do this, make these a lot nicer and cleaner. The other problem that I didn't like about that over here was I'm tying this UI class concern with load into the middle of this select person, and select person is meant to be sort of an abstract operation. I'd sort of like what select person is gonna do in terms of IO to be kind of a separate thing, right? I don't necessarily want it there. Because that ties me to, let's say I had a different part of my UI where I select people and I need to use a different class to query for, I'd be stuck, right? So there's a thing I could do here. I could say, all right, well, you know what? Let's just get the target class as a parameter, right? Let's let you pass that in the mutation, and so we can just say that that's my query class. We can just call it query class. That's better, right? Okay, so that doesn't seem so bad. So I could go over here and I could say, okay, select person. And then when I'm selecting them, I need to say there's a query class, and that's going to be, in this particular case, person detail. That's what I want. All right. And then click on this thing. Hey, there we go. Now we're getting the right thing, and you can see as I select them on the network, it loads the details that I need and gets the answer back. Now, of course, you're in a distributed system, so other people could be modifying Sally, and so this sort of makes sense. As you select one, you probably want to see the most recent information. So this is a very common pattern. Now, we're not done yet because there are still some problems with this. We can do this way, but this puts a React class into our transaction. So our transaction, which could be a remote thing. We don't know from the UI layer. So if you put data into a transaction that's not serializable via transit, you'll get transit errors and the thing will fail. So, and this takes me to another point. This load is kind of a separate, like, individual step here. I mean, I could come over here and say, all right, I want to load that person, right? This kind of is just another way of doing it. Right? I could say, oh, all right, on click, load the person, and then select them. And that seems like a reasonable thing to do. And over here, this now becomes just a pure UI concern of adding the edge in. All right. And in fact, this is kind of a nice option. Actually, now that I think about it, I hadn't done it this way when I was thinking about it. But this solves it the same way. If I go look at the network, you can see I'm getting these things. The transactions are literal loads now, and then selects. This is reverse chronological, by the way, so the stuff goes down. The topmost one's most recent. So this is another way of doing it. And if you remember, load has a way to target edges. Well, my target edge is this picker path. So I could just grab this picker path function, which probably shouldn't be in that namespace now that I think about it. But let's just pick it up. For convenience, we'll organize code on someone else's time. Person picker, selected person. So I could do that, get rid of the transaction altogether, and now my load heals the edge as part of the load. That's kind of nice, right? I actually kind of like that solution for this particular case, because it indicates exactly the complete thing that you're doing. The criticism that I would have of it is it sort of exposes to this particular person list item exactly what needs to be done, sort of in kind of a non-component local sense. So you're kind of peppering some logic in there. But let me show you some other alternatives. Okay, so we have that alternative. Let's say we don't want to use load. Let's say instead, well, we're already doing a transaction that has the abstract operation in mind. We did complain about, well, you know, we've got this target, what was it, query class. We could pass this query class person detail. And we're going to want that no matter how we do this, because we do need to interact with the server and say, here's the stuff that I need back when selecting this person. So we do want to pass something like that. But what we could do is we could say that this is a remote operation. Now you might say, well, what does the server need to know or do in response to selecting a person? Well, the answer is nothing in particular. However, this is a graph system. So the mutation for select person on the server, and this seems a little silly, could just echo back the parameter, right? The parameter map. Specifically, it's echoing back a map that specifies I'm returning an entity that has this person ID fact that's this ID. And then here I can say that I'm returning, well, I don't say I'm returning anything because it's person ID is already in context. So that's really all I need to say for that mutation. Then I can add it to my list of things, restart the in the right REPL, restart the server, Okay, so now what I've said is this is my local thing that I need to do, heal this edge so it points at the right person. And then here I've said, oh, and I'm going to go remotely. Now, first, let me point out the problem, the first problem we're going to run into with this technique, and that's that when I click on this, I'm going to get an error. And I'm going to get an error for the reason I mentioned just a minute ago. I can't write that class across the network. So this is actually, if we search through it, we're going to see in here at some layer some transit thing happened, and it may not even be easy to see that that's what happened. But there during transmit, it tried to send it, and it wasn't able to encode it. So that's because the query class here is a JavaScript object. It's a JavaScript class, and it's got a bunch of crap on it that just can't be serialized. So if we go back to the UI, Fulcro has a registry of all classes that have been defined, and it puts them in there under a keyword that's the namespace that they're in, so app.client, and then the name of the class. So I could pass this as a keyword, which can be encoded over the network. And so now when I clear this and click on someone, I no longer get an error. Right? I've still got the one error before, but if I clear that out, you can see that I'm going back and forth. So this is actually demonstrating two interesting things. One, select person is going across the network, and the select person mutation is actually returning. Let me do that as a network. The select person mutation, notice it sent a tagged value unknown app person detail, like it encoded the keyword into something. It shows it as unknown here because of the way the application has to talk to a Chrome extension. It can't actually encode the stuff quite right. So when you see these tagged values unknown, it's just a artifact of how inspect works. So you see it tried to send that query class across the network. That was okay. And then it returned, well, actually it returned nothing. It says pending. Why does it say pending? Could be that my server didn't like it. Yeah, I think I've still got some. Oh, did I restart my server? I did restart my server. Just make sure we haven't hosed something. Okay, we got a warning there. And here we got transactions on the network. We got something that succeeded. So here's a comment that's important to understand. If a network request hangs on the server, Fulcro does queue transactions. This is a transaction processing system, and the remotes are serialized so that you can reason about them. And so if one hangs, the rest can hang. So that may be what we ran into there a second ago. You can see the response here did return person ID 2. Right? So that's even though I sent a query of person ID 2, I got a response of person ID 2, but I didn't tell the Pathome side any extra details I wanted, nor did I tell Fulcro how that data might need to be merged. And so it really didn't help me yet. However, there are ways to do this. Okay, so one of the things I was trying to show you is how to get around this query class being passed as a thing. But notice it's still trying to put it over the network. In Fulcro land, prefixing a keyword with UI should cause it to be elided from queries or mutations that go across the network. These are considered, this namespace on keyword are considered UI only details, and the internals of Fulcro try to keep those from going places. So now if we run this, we see that it's still there. Sorry, that evidently is only working for queries, which is actually what I expected. So let's not do that there. Okay, so The fact that we're trying to pass this as a parameter causes us some issues, but let me go ahead and take the UI out of that and show you where I was headed with this. Again, this isn't the best solution, but I've got the query class. So what you can do here in the remote is you can change how the request is sent. And the mutations namespace has these. So you can change the parameters. And I can go back here and I can just use person detail now. Because basically now I'm saying only send the parameter person ID and then the ID, which is rewriting the parameter list that had query class in it. So this is keeping that from going over the network. The other interesting thing that I can do is I can say returning and then the class that I'd like to return. Okay, so this is the other option that I have. So returning takes an env. Remember, you can return an env from remote to indicate, yeah, I just want to do whatever's an env, and these functions modify the env to say what should go on. So this is indicating to Fulcro that the remote mutation can return stuff, and here's the stuff that I'd like it to return. So remember, on the server side, all I did was said select person's a mutation, and it gets a person ID, and then it returns a map with person ID in it. But remember that the resolvers, all these resolvers, work with person ID as an input. So any of those can run to fulfill the rest of any query that happens to be sitting on the back end of this mutation. And so that's what we're doing now. And so you see the details are filling out now. Right? And if we look in the request that gets sent, we see the call select person is surrounded by a join. So the call is now the key. And then the subquery of the join is I want name, ID, age, and their cars with car ID and car model. And so that fills out the details. If we look at what came back, select person has all that stuff and the nested stuff filled in. And Pathome just magically did that for us because we gave it enough context in the return value of the mutation that the return query on the mutation could be satisfied. And Fulcro understands from that metadata on the query of that component where to put it and how to normalize it. So we're essentially overwriting those elements as we go. Okay, so let's take this a step further. So we've got this extra mutation we've defined on the server, and we kind of need that if we want to deal with these return values like this. We had the option of doing the load here, and then we were passing in this whole query class thing. And this is sort of a join point that I don't love, right? It's making us have to change the parameters, etc. So what if we could find a way to eliminate that so that we didn't have to have that, so we could just say, yeah, this is going to run remotely and return some stuff. Right? So we want to kind of get it out of this place and bring it back over to here. Well, you saw just a second ago exactly what query that resulted in. You can actually write that inside of this transact. So let's reload, show this is broken again. Right? I get Bob, Sally, no age or cars. And so what I can do here is wrap that in a join, and then as the subquery of the join, I can say comp get query person detail. And so now I'm saying run this mutation, and if it happens to be remote, merge the remote return value via this person detail query. Well, query for it this way and merge it. So I need to make sure that select person is still remote. Manually write the mutation join here, and now my details should fill in. Did I not save? There it goes. I'm not sure why I needed to reload, but we can see the transaction on the network is still the same transaction it had before. It's just a different way of writing it. So these are the various ways you can deal with getting these things. And again, now that we've gone through them all, I think I personally would have preferred the load in this particular scenario, but there are places where kind of all these different combinations make sense in your toolbox. So sometimes you might want to explicitly write the mutation join. Sometimes you want to go into this actual mutation and throw it in here as part of your returning on your remote. Sometimes you might want to issue a load in here. It just depends on how your namespaces are laid out, how your things are coupled or decoupled, how they're designed. There's just a lot of variability. But again, I think for this particular example, at least I think the most clear way of doing this was to say, well, I want to load person using the person detail query and target it at the picker path for selected person. That seemed to be the one that kind of had the clearest semantics, particularly since we don't need to reify the idea of selection. So that's kind of a trade-off. The nice thing about the alternative that we had with a transact is that the select is now a mutation that you could use in, say, generative testing. Like you could simulate clicking on someone by invoking that mutation, whereas here you kind of have to have a real browser click. So again, I can go back and forth on the different pros and cons to all of this, but I wanted you to see these different scenarios for progressing your state model over time.